It is great to be back at the Morgan Library, especially in this amazing book-filled room, which is a testament to human creativity and all the learning that's come down to us through the ages. And it makes you wonder, how did we, Homo sapiens, manage to create all this culture? There have been a lot of theories about what is distinctive about human beings, what separates us from the rest of the animal world. It was once said that we were the only tool makers, and then Jane Goodall came along and found that chimpanzees strip off the leaves of twigs to fish for termites. We were thought to be the only creatures with language, and then we found out that whales and prairie dogs and lots of other species have their own forms of language. And we were thought to be the only self-aware animal, and then various species, including dolphins and elephants and orangutans, passed the mirror test. More recently, another idea has emerged about what it might be our unique superpower. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould said, "Humans are the primates who tell stories." The historian Yuval Noah Harari says, "Stories are the greatest human invention." And Joan Didion put it this way, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." So that leads to one of our big questions for the evening. Why are we so compelled to tell stories? And what makes a good story? And there's also a related question, what makes a narrative that we believe, that has plausible explanations for how the world works? And what does all this have to do with how we think and how we learn? Because there is another looming question. It's not just how we are unlike other animals, but how we're different from artificial intelligence, or are we so different? So we have a lot to talk about, and I cannot think of a better person to help us unpack these questions than Tania Lombrozo, the director of the Concepts and Cognition Lab at Princeton University. She's an award-winning and eminent psychologist who is also affiliated with Princeton's philosophy department, which means that she has a grounding both in empirical research and she asks the big questions, which is what I love to talk about. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Tania Lombrozo.
Oh, thank you so much for having me in this beautiful setting.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I want to pick up with this idea that humans are innate storytellers. So why did we evolve this drive when, as far as we can tell, no other animal species seem to be compelled to tell stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love the way you set this up because you pointed out all of these other ideas that people have shared about what it is that might make humans special, right? Maybe it's language, maybe it's our capacity for symbolic thinking, for abstract thinking, and so on. And if you think of part of what stories do, they combine all of those elements together. The typical story is something that uses language to convey something that's complicated and abstract, and that doesn't just keep it in one organism's mind, but really transmits it to another organism, a conspecific. So I like to think of stories as a kind of social technology. It's sort of the mind's QR code for transmitting something from one mind to another mind, right? So if you think about what a story does, is it takes an extremely complicated set of causal relationships that we know about in the world, our own evaluations and judgments and opinions about who was to blame and why things happened and so on, and we compress it down into a form that we can share with another person, and then that other person can unpack it on their end and reconstruct all of that complexity and figure out who they ought to blame and why things happened and so on. So stories have all of these properties that I think have the right features to be the sorts of things that humans remember, the sorts of things that support human judgments and inferences.
So presumably there was evolutionary advantage, or there still is, to tell stories. I mean, what is it that this does that other animal species don't do?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to answer by appealing to clear data because we don't have other species that tell things that are like stories but not quite in order to compare it to, right? So this is going to take us into the realm of speculation. But if you think about stories as being a specific kind of communication, then we can ask what's special about that kind of communication. And I think part of what stories do is that they don't just communicate information like A caused B or A happened before B. They also communicate something about the moral judgments, the evaluations, the feelings that we ought to have that go along with that information, right? So if I tell you a story of the form A caused B caused C, that's really boring and you're not going to remember it. But instead I tell you that, I'll give you a concrete example from psychology, right? So suppose I'm telling you about a car accident that happened. if I say one car bumped into another car or contacted another car, that's very different from saying A smashed into the other car, right? Subtle difference in which words I used, but it's constructed a different mental image in your head, and it's probably going to lead you to different judgments about who was at fault, should you be mad, and so on. Right?
So and it's something we're going to remember then. And I think probably partly because the good stories tend to have emotion in them, right?
That's right. If you think about what makes a good story, it often has a lot of emotion. It often has a lot of perceptual detail, right? Good stories sort of paint pictures in your head. And they're not just visual pictures. They can also be what somebody's voice sounded like, what it felt like, right? So they really play into all of our senses. And we know from studies in psychology that that's going to have benefits for memory. People are going to remember that better. And we also know that it's going to allow you to do a better job of understanding something from the perspective of the person who is telling the story or who had that experience. You really can put yourself in their shoes when you have all of those features of a story that you're not going to just get with a sort of account that tells you that A caused B caused C.
So do you think it's through stories that we construct our version of reality?
Gosh, that's a big question. Because I study stories and explanations, I want to say yes, but recognizing all of the other important aspects of human psychology, I'm going to have to say no. I think it's going to be one piece of it, but if you think about just things like our perceptual system, right, that's going to play another huge part of how it is that we make inferences about reality.
Okay, because there's a related question, which is how we come up with explanations for how the world works. And I know they're connected, but they're not exactly the same. So can you kind of spell out the difference between stories and explanatory narratives?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I think about them is that both stories and explanations can be answers to why questions. And in that sense, they're kind of similar. But I think about them as being on two ends of a continuum. So if you think about what makes a good story, as we were just discussing, a good story has a temporal structure. It involves lots of concrete details about what happened. A good explanation, on the other hand, especially if you think about something like a good scientific explanation, tends to appeal to much more abstract generalizations. So in the case of something like science, often when you give an explanation, you appeal to something like a general law of physics or some sort of generalization from that science to explain a particular case. And so that seems very different, right? On the story side, we have this temporally structured sequence of very concrete details. On the explanation side, we're abstracting as much as we can. I think of these as serving different but related cognitive functions. On the story side, you can put yourself in somebody's shoes, see it from their perspective, create a mental image, and that has all sorts of advantages. On the sort of explanation side, where you're working more abstractly, you're learning something that you can generalize to new cases. Right? When you relate something to like an abstract pattern or a law, you're not just learning about the specific case you're explaining, you're learning something that's going to tell you very broadly about lots of things in the world. So both of these are super useful cognitive activities. And what happens is that in everyday situations, somebody asks you something like, why were you late to work? And you do some blend of the two, right? You might say something like traffic. And we all know that there's this sadly reliable generalization in the world where traffic can make you late. But they don't just tell you traffic, right? They tell you that they were so tired and they spilled their coffee and their child complained about such and such, right? You also get the story. Right? So I think really one of the things that's really powerful about explanations and stories in human cognition is that we can so flexibly combine them.
So we started out by talking about what separates humans from the rest of the animal world. And so we've already said that, humans seem to be the only species, as far as we know, who tell stories. And I'm wondering if that's also true with explanations. So for instance, if I am put on my coat and get out the leash, my dog knows that we're going to go for a walk. I'm not sure if he knows much more than that, if he sort of has constructed sort of a system of explanation of what's going to happen after that.
Right. So I tend to think of there being a sort of thin notion of explanation that we share with probably many non-human animals, and then this much sort of richer, uniquely human version. So the thin version is the kind of explaining that happens whenever you draw some sort of an inference about what might have been the cause to explain some observed effect. Right, so for example, your dog hears a noise. It might draw an inference that the best explanation for that noise is that you've come in through the hallway, and it might go test the hypothesis that you've come in through the hallway by going in that direction. I think that's a fine way to use the term explanation, but very often when we're talking about humans engaged in explanation, we mean something much richer than that. I think canonically explanations are lacks of language. They don't have to be. Sometimes a gesture or a picture might serve as an explanation, but canonically, it's a pretty complicated linguistic phenomenon. Typically, it's communicative. I think overwhelmingly when we're explaining, it is with an intended audience in mind. And I think sometimes that intended audience is ourselves, right? So I think we explain to ourselves. There's a lot to say about that. I'm happy to get into that if you'd like to. But even when we're explaining to ourselves, we are the intended audience. And so there's this more complicated aspect of communication that happens in those cases where you really have to think about what you know, what the other person knows, why you think they're asking, why they want an explanation. And as far as I know, humans are the only species that engage in that richer form of explanation.
So we also seem to be a species that is obsessed with why questions. And it starts when we're kids. And I mean, do we know is there a certain age when children start to ask why questions?
Yes, and part of what's fascinating about that is that they basically start to ask why questions as soon as they have the language capacity to do so. Usually in their second year, maybe around year 2.5, kids will start asking lots of questions. Many of those will be why questions. Many of those seem to be why questions that are in search of causal explanations. Part of how we know that is because people have come up with really clever studies to rule out some alternative explanations, right? So many people have had the experience of seeing these very young children asking these why questions, and you might wonder, well, are they really looking for an explanation, or have they just figured out that this is like a button you can push that gets you attention, right? That makes your parents interact with you, makes your parents produce more language. And so one of the really clever things that psychologists did was that they looked at these transcripts of conversations between parents and their young children, and they made the following sort of line of thinking. If kids just are after social interaction, they've realized you push the Y button and your parents give you some attention, then they shouldn't really care whether the adult gives a good explanation or a bad explanation, right? As long as they get a response, that's good. But if they're really after an explanation, then when the child says why and the adult gives a bad explanation or no explanation or says that's just the way it is, something that's unsatisfying, we should expect the child to do something like ask again. And so that's what they found in these naturalistic transcripts of conversations. These 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds were asking all sorts of why questions. When their caregiver would give back a good explanation, the kids would often accept it, say, oh, yeah, and then they would ask a follow-up question. But when the adult said something like, because I said so, or just because, or something that was irrelevant, the child would tend to re-ask the question or try to give their own explanation, right? And so that really tells us that these why questions are quite sophisticated already at age 2. By the time kids get to age 3 and 4, they're often producing a lot of their own explanations as well, not just asking why, but offering their own possible explanations, either spontaneously in response to their observations or because a parent or somebody else asked them.
And do those, I assume that the kind of why questions changes as they become 5 or 6 or 10 or something like that.
They do get more complicated linguistically, right? So 2-year-olds tend to not be producing very complicated utterances. That's one way that they change. There is some evidence that they also change in terms of what kinds of questions they're targeting, what they're asking about. But one of the things that you see consistently from age 2 all the way to the ages of all of us in this room today is that one of the biggest domains that we tend to ask about is the social world. So kids are asking why people are doing things, why people are behaving the way they are, and so on. And we're doing that too, right? I mean, that's what happens around the water cooler in offices, is people are gossiping about each other, right? They're asking about each other's behavior. So that preoccupation with explaining aspects of our social world seems to be pretty consistent.
So they're looking for reasons for agency, sort of like why other people are doing certain things, and presumably because it has an impact on the kids themselves. That's
right. That is one of the largest topics of spontaneous explanations in the research that's been documented. But it's worth saying that that's not the only thing that children ask or that adults ask, right? I mean, they also ask about the biological world, the natural world, all sorts of other things. By the time you get a little bit older, sometimes they're asking questions like, why are we here?
So I'm curious to turn the discussion to you. Were you the kind of kid who asked why questions from an early age?
When I've asked my parents, they have assured me that this is the case. I don't have a particular memory of being, I'd say, any more explicitly inquisitive about this, but I think I, like many people, have always had that internal dialogue that's going on in my own head, asking me, why is that the way it is? Why are people behaving the way they do, and so on. And I think in my case, that's one of the reasons I was so interested in psychology, is because I take that to be one of our best efforts to answer some of those questions using the tools of science.
So when you got a little bit older and you do remember sort of the kinds of questions that you asked, were you asking kind of the existential why questions, the big sort of why are we here kinds of questions when you were still a kid?
I think I was to some extent. Although I'm going to confess I'm a little, because I've studied a lot of psychology and know about human memory, I'm very suspicious of how accurate my own memory is of these particular ages. Part of the reason I'm suspicious is because my first thought would be, of course, I must have been. But if you look at anthropological accounts of what sorts of questions people ask across cultures, it's not the case that people are necessarily always asking these big existential questions, right? So one widespread idea for the origin of a lot of religious beliefs was that we have this universal tendency as humans to ask these big existential questions, and certain kinds of religious beliefs might give us ways to answer those big existential questions. But when anthropologists have gone to various cultures and seen what are the sorts of things that people talk about spontaneously in conversations, what are the questions they're asking, what seem to be the why questions they are asking, very often they are the ones that are much more tied to our immediate day-to-day experience and our immediate needs. And that makes me think that even if we all have a capacity to ask these kinds of questions, that it might be a bit of a luxury to have those moments where we can take a step back from our immediate needs, the immediate day-to-day things that we have to be doing in order to engage with these kinds of questions deeply.
So going back to your own personal story, I can imagine that if you wanted to make a career out of probing these why questions, one logical path would be into the sciences. Another might be to go into psychology, into philosophy, I was going to say. And you've kind of done both.
I've tried.
Psychology I know is sort of, has been the thing that you got your PhD in, but are there differences in sort of, approaching these questions through psychology as opposed to philosophy?
There are definitely differences in the day-to-day methods that people employ, and these are the differences that I think are obvious from the outside for people who are not philosophers or psychologists, right? So psychologists typically will be collecting data, for example, asking empirical questions, and philosophers are often not doing that. They might be informed by what's going on in psychology and other fields, but are typically engaged in much more theoretical kinds of enterprises. But I'm somebody who thinks that there is not a sharp dividing line between philosophy and the natural sciences and many other human endeavors. So in my mind, one of the places where you see this continuity is that in order to ask a good empirical question, you need to pose it well. You need to sort of be clear about what your concepts are in order to be able to ask a question that you can then go out and measure in the world. And I think one of the things that philosophy is very good at doing is giving us the tools to understand sort of the space of possible questions that we could ask and what the reasons are that might make some questions better than other kinds of questions. And I realize this is extremely abstract, so let me give you sort of a toy example that I sometimes use. So suppose, I'm looking out this beautiful space at the Morgan Library, and I notice that people sitting in chairs that have 4 legs. And I could ask the question, why do the chairs in this room have a number of legs that is a perfect square? Right? 4 is a perfect square. It's 2 squared. There's something very weird about that question, right? Not just because you might think I already have the answer, but you might think that I sort of have set it up in a way that seems to presuppose that it's relevant, that the number of legs is a perfect square. And that sort of seems like it's already setting you up on the wrong track if I even ask the question that way, right? So I think we often take for granted that we ask questions in ways that constrain the set of possibilities we consider and that point us in particular directions. And sometimes when we see these questions that you see like, that just seems off. You haven't got it right. I think it helps us realize the way that the very questions just constrain the enterprise that we're pursuing. So I think philosophy can be very helpful for that. But I also think that the empirical sciences won't answer all of our questions. They're certainly not going to answer all of our why questions. One reason is because a lot of the things that we care about are things that involve some sort of prescriptive or normative or valuative element, right? It's not just describing the way the world is, but is tied into how we think the world ought to be.
So I want to come back to how
Okay.
the world ought to be, but just to how the world is. So I can imagine, I mean, in terms of this drive to come up with explanations, I certainly can understand sort of the survival value of that for our ancestors, how to survive on the savannah. It's sort of like you want to do certain things to, get away from the lion. I mean, we're talking about sort of, how to construct your version of reality that has real consequences. I guess I'm wondering if that still is true today. I mean, do we still need that kind of explanatory framework to survive in this world now? I mean, do we need kind of an accurate version of reality?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I think there's two questions there.
Okay.
So one is something like, do we need narratives or stories or explanations? And I think the answer there is absolutely. I think it's one of the basic ways that we represent reality in a way that's usable to us. Right, so I mean, here's a different analogy, right? Suppose you wanted to know how to get from here to another part of Manhattan. There's lots of ways that you could get that information, right? Somebody could give you the coordinates, global coordinates from one place to another. But what you probably want is something that's going to actually tell you, like, okay, but do I walk 2 blocks in that direction or in this direction? And then do I go left or do I go right? You kind of want a representation that's going to actually successfully guide your actions. And I think that's what stories and explanations do, is they take very complicated aspects of reality, but they represent them for us. They package them for us in a way that's actually usable by human minds. And so for that reason, I want to say, yes, we still need them. Do we need them to be accurate? I think I also want to say yes. Yes, there. And I'm curious to ask, why would we have less need for that now? Are you thinking that we can...
Because we're not on the edge of survival, I think, as our ancient ancestors were. We've got sort of, relatively cushy ways to get along. And I just throwing that out there. I mean, I'm just sort of wondering how important that is to have really a clear sense of how the world actually works.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's going to be important for a variety of reasons. So one of it is that we still do make all sorts of decisions that are affect our survival and well-being. Maybe we take them for granted, but they're still decisions. We make decisions about where and when to cross the street. We make decisions about which medicines to take and under what conditions and so on. Often we do that by deferring to experts, but they're experts who provide us with perhaps sort of minimal stories or explanations that help us understand why we're doing that. These are all cases that have important consequences for our everyday lives. And the other point I'd make, and maybe this is where you want to lead me, is that I think there's some value to our stories and explanations that goes beyond guiding our everyday instrumental actions. I think it also plays a role in regulating our emotions, for example, giving us a sense of meaning and purpose and so on.
So I want to go into that question of meaning and purpose. I mean, we are meaning-seeking creatures. I mean, we look for meaning, and we will, I think, sort of find meaning even if it's not, obviously there. And that seems like sort of possibly a different kind of category of explanation. I mean, you talked about religion earlier. I mean, because a lot of this search for meaning has to do with what is the proper moral behavior, our value judgments. That it seems like that comes into these questions about looking for meaning and purpose.
Yeah, let me tell you about some studies we did that I think speak to this. So a few years ago, we did a series of studies where we asked dozens and dozens of people to answer various kinds of existential questions. So these were questions like, why is there suffering in the world? What happens after we die? How did the universe come to exist? And we chose these questions because I think they are the sorts of big existential why questions that some people do ask themselves, and also because they're the kinds of questions, I think not coincidentally, that often people give both scientific and religious answers to. So in a sample, these were participants based in the US, and we got a huge range of answers to these kinds of questions. Some of them were religious, some of them were scientific, some of them were a blend of the two, some of them were more sort of common sense rather than scientific per se, but were not religious and so on. And what we were interested in is what kinds of properties people thought these explanations had. And one of the set of properties we looked at was something like, how accurate is this? How true is this story, right? So we'd ask them questions like, to what extent do you think this explanation is based on evidence? To what extent do you think it's logically consistent, and so on? But then we also asked them all these other kinds of questions, sort of meaning and purpose questions. We asked them whether or not they found an explanation comforting. We asked them whether or not we thought that believing in that explanation would make the world better. We asked them whether or not that was the kind of explanation that brought people together, and so on. And what we found was that on average, people thought the scientific explanations were better along these accuracy, truth sorts of dimensions. But on average, people thought the religious explanations were much better along these other dimensions, which we sort of characterize as sort of emotional, social, and moral dimensions. And so they were really playing complementary kinds of roles for people. And they're both roles that are important.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that one of the challenges for atheists and humanists today is, if you're trying to come up with some sort of larger explanation for why we're here. I mean, you can come up with that scientific explanation of, it's like the galaxies formed in a certain way, the Earth happened, life somehow appeared, and then humans maybe were sort of this lucky accident in evolution or something like that. Scientifically, you can sort of chart that, a lot of that. It doesn't provide a lot of comfort in a lot of senses, whereas, religion does give you that story of purpose of why we're here. Do you see that as a challenge for the people who don't have sort of this larger, I guess what I would call religious framework?
Yeah, I guess I want to say yes and no. So I'll tell you the yes first. So one of the things that we did in this same series of studies is that we actually asked our participants to give us the most comforting answer they could in response to a question like, why are we here? Why is there suffering in the world? And so on. And then we read through all of their explanations and we tried to identify what were the strategies that people had for coming up with comforting explanations. Religious explanations were among the most common, but we did find some subset of our participants who I think successfully came up with ways to provide comfort that were not religious. So for example, in response to a question about what happens after we die, people could talk about the ways in which people's legacy could live on, the way that they could live on in people's memories and so on. Sometimes our participants would write very poetic things about how we're made of stardust and part of the universe and so on. So I do think people can do it in that sense. We did find that on average, those sort of secular comforting explanations were less comforting than the religious ones, right? So it's really nice to live on in the memories of our loved ones. It'd be even nicer if we could live eternally together, right?
And you kind of have to, you probably have to know a fair amount of science to come up with some of those explanations, and you maybe have to work at it a little bit more to find the comfort in those, because it's not obvious as a religious explanation would be.
Yeah, I think that's right. But to get into the second part of my answer, I think science and religion do not exhaust the space of all possible resources that we have as humans for finding meaning, right? So there's a lot that I think is not scientific and not religious, but might still be a source of meaning. And we're surrounded in a library full of books. And if we were to look around, they're going to include all sorts of ideas. There's going to be kinds of art. There's going to be philosophy, right? There's lots of aspects of human experience that I think we can look to provide some of those things for people who do not have religious beliefs that maybe provide that kind of comfort.
So it seems to me that one of the things that we're looking for are intellectually honest belief systems. And that's sort of what we're after here, I think. And you had a really interesting thought experiment that you did. I don't know if it was with your class, where you were sort of asking people to imagine their ideal belief system. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of context for this. One strategy that cognitive scientists sometimes use when they want to understand some cognitive capacity is they think about what the ideal version of it would be, so that we have some reference point for figuring out how well humans are doing. And so one place where people do this a lot is in the context of perception. And so people will develop what they call ideal observer analyses. And so we can look at situations and see what's the best you could do with the perceptual information in front of you in terms of reconstructing what's actually out there. And if we know what the best you could do is, what the ideal is, now we have a reference point for asking, well, how well are humans doing? I mean, sure, sometimes we're susceptible to visual illusions or get things wrong, but maybe we're doing the best we can given the evidence that's actually available to us. And so with that sort of approach in mind, I started asking myself, what would an ideal believer look like, right? What would it look like to be the best kind of believer you could be? What does that even mean? And really posing this as an invitation to think about ways in which that might bring in assumptions that we're already bringing to the table about what it is to believe. But let's for a moment start with a sort of narrow notion of what it would mean to be an ideal believer. Suppose that an ideal believer is somebody who just has the most accurate beliefs. That's the only dimension we care about. Well, if that's true, we could try to figure out what ought human belief to be like in order to be the most accurate. So here's a couple things you might expect. if our only goal with our beliefs is to be as accurate as possible, then you ought to expect beliefs to change every time you get new evidence. They might only change a little bit, right? Because you have a whole lifetime of evidence that's pushed you towards one direction, and then you get a little bit of evidence that pushes you in another direction. But it means our beliefs should constantly be changing as we get new evidence. And in fact, that's the ideal of how science works. But that doesn't seem to be how a lot of human beliefs work. I mean, if any of you have had an argument with a colleague about a political issue or a moral issue, right, normally presenting what you take to be very good evidence doesn't necessarily result in a change in their beliefs. So that's really interesting, because that suggests we're seeing a systematic difference between the way human belief actually works and what we might expect on this sort of thought experiment of thinking about ideal believers who are just tracking the truth. And so that's why I think that's useful. It gives us traction in thinking about what sorts of properties we'd expect beliefs to have under certain assumptions, and maybe are those assumptions wrong? Do we need to think about it differently?
Mm-hmm. So you like thought experiments, right?
I do.
Yeah. So why?
So I think we can learn a huge amount by looking at the world and collecting data. In my psychologist mode, that's what I do. I run a lab and we go out and collect data. But I also think we can learn a huge amount through reflection and reasoning, sometimes from our armchairs. And that's what often happens in philosophy, and occasionally has happened in the history of science when there have been these really influential thought experiments. Einstein and Galileo and others have had these very famous thought experiments.
Tell me about one of those, either Galileo or Einstein. So, because,
Yeah.
I mean, this is really sort of this classic case of coming up with a revolutionary idea, just as you say, sitting in your armchair. It's
Yeah.
you're not going out doing experiments. You're just sort of reimagining the world, and it actually can change the world in a few cases.
Right. So I love Galileo's. I'm going to try to give you the quick version. If there's any historians listening, I apologize if I'm getting this a little bit wrong. But the basic sort of question at the time was whether or not objects that have different mass would fall at the same rate or would fall at different rates. And so you're now invited to imagine having something very light ball, and a very heavy ball. And you're going to drop them from a great height at the same time. And so we want to know, are they going to basically reach the bottom at the same time, or is it the case that the one that's more massive is going to reach there first? All right, so Galileo invites us to imagine connecting these two spheres, the light one and the heavy one, with a very thin rod. All right, well, what should we predict now? One way to think about what's happened is you've just created one object that's even heavier than either of the two that you started with, right? So if one was 1 pound and one was 10 pounds and the rod was half a pound, right, we now have 11.5 pounds. So it ought to fall even faster than either of the balls did together. And you might have that intuition, but there's another intuition which seems pretty compelling, which is that somehow you should get the average between the two, right? That somehow when you connect these, the heavy one's going to be kind of like pulling it down, but the light one's going to be kind of dragging behind, and so it's going to reach the ground at some time that's in between the time it would have reached if it was just the light one or just the heavy one. How do you resolve this tension? I mean, you could go out and do the experiment and try to get very precise measurements and so on. But part of what Galileo argued is that the only way to reconcile is to assume that actually the rate of the fall does not depend on the weight. Because if it does not depend on the weight, you resolve this puzzle, right? It's the same amount of time from that given height, whether you're dealing with a light ball, the heavy ball, or this new constructed object that connects those two. I think that's really clever.
So he worked that out without the experiment, then?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think we should end there. We should then go do the experiments.
Mm-hmm, right.
But that's really clever. So part of what I think thought experiments illustrate is a phenomenon that I've called learning by thinking. And these are cases where it seems like we come to learn something genuinely new, but in the absence of novel external data. And the most celebrated cases are the ones like Galileo and Einstein, but I think actually this is a very mundane phenomenon that happens all the time. So I'll give you an example. You're packing for a trip, and you're trying to figure out how to get the luggage to fit in the back of the trunk of your car. How do you do this? Well, you could just do it by trial and error. You could try lots of different arrangements and see how it finally works, and sometimes that's how it goes. But I think very often before you do that, you do a mental simulation. You sort of do an experiment in your head where you imagine to yourself, well, how would it fit if I put that piece of luggage horizontally and this one to the side and so on? And you figure it out in your head first. And then you just implement the solution that you came up with. And I think that's an instance of learning by thinking too. It's a very everyday, mundane case, but I think we do this all the time.
So going back to Galileo and Einstein, and we could cite lots of other people as well. What do you think are the distinguishing characteristics of truly creative people? What are they doing that the rest of us don't do?
Goodness, that's such a great question. So when psychologists study creativity, they typically differentiate sort of two things that you need in order for something to be creative. First, it has to be novel in some way, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's going to require a capacity to generate ideas that depart from the ones that we're surrounded with. But they also need to be in some way valuable or useful, right? So there's lots of ways to arrange paint on a canvas that might be novel. Not all of those are going to be truly creative. And it's that second part, figuring out what counts as valuable or useful, that I think is really complicated and probably varies enormously by different domains of creativity, right? What it means to be valuable or useful for a painting is going to be very different from what it means to be valuable or useful for a scientific experiment.
So maybe the great experiments, the truly innovative scientists who are doing these experiments, or the thought experiments, is they're just imagining things that no one's ever thought about before.
I think they're doing two things. I think that's one big part of it, and that's where you get the novelty. Mm-hmm. But then you also need to be able to evaluate which kinds of novelty are valuable.
Right.
Right? So there's sort of the generation part where it's being able to come up with ideas that are relatively untethered to your environment and your social and physical environment, because everybody else is being influenced by our social and physical environment in similar ways, right? So you have to be able to come up with something which is not constrained to the same extent or in the same way that other people's thinking is. But then you also need to be able to recognize something that is useful or valuable when you succeed in generating it.
Which is fascinating to think about, because you would think that we kind of all know what would be useful, like what doesn't exist right now, but maybe if we could come up with something, but obviously not. I mean, it's sort of to actually think about things that we never would have even dreamed might be useful.
I think that's right. I wish I could come up with better examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's many cases where it took us a while to figure out how to make something useful, right? So I don't know, when Velcro was first discovered, which I think was maybe partially for different purposes, did people immediately realize all of the possible uses of Velcro? And I suspect there's all sorts of cases like that, right? There's being able to realize the potential for how you apply something or what you do with it, I think is itself often not trivial.
How does curiosity figure into this?
Great question. So as you might imagine, psychologists and other scholars disagree about how to define curiosity, but overwhelmingly, one of the ideas that you find across lots of accounts is that we at least experience curiosity as learning for the sake of learning. We don't tend to experience curiosity as being purely instrumental, right? So for example, if you need to know what's supposed to go on line 15 of some tax form, you might be motivated to get that information, but you probably would not say you're curious about it, right? The only reason you want that information is because you have to fill out line 15 in your tax form correctly. When we say we're curious, it's typically because we want to know, like, just for the sake of knowing. It's not because it's going to, like, make us do better on a trivia quiz. It's because we just want to know. And I think part of what that reflects is processes of learning and information seeking that are genuinely exploratory. We're actually not being constrained by what we know already to be useful or valuable, but very, very often it's that basic research wing of human learning that actually means that we learn what we need to in order to then be in a position to do things that are useful and valuable. So I think of it as sort of in those terms. That's the basic research side of human learning.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of assuming that thinking is, by definition, great. I mean, that's sort of, one of the distinguishing characteristics of what it means to be human, at least to be thinking in sort of these more complicated, sophisticated ways. But it seems like thinking can also be dangerous at times. I mean, a little knowledge can lead us in some bad directions.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I'll tell you two places where I've seen evidence for this empirically, although there's more. So one is that in studies of expertise, where people look at, what does it look like to go from being a novice radiologist to an expert radiologist, or a novice chess player to an expert chess player? People have studied this in lots of different domains. And you often do find that there's a point at which people tend to be quite bad, and it's when they've learned a little bit. And one of the ways in which they tend to be quite bad is that they're not well calibrated yet. They don't yet have a good sense of what they don't know, right? One of the things that actually comes with more expertise is that you are better at recognizing all of the things that you don't know. So I think that that's consistent with what you're saying. Another example I'll give you is from my own research, cases where we find that seeking an explanation or sort of like thinking harder or trying to find structure more can actually be bad. So one of the things that we found is that when people are actively engaged in trying to find an explanation, they typically want to find a good explanation. That makes a lot of sense. And good explanations are typically those that in some way are sort of simple and broad. Ideally, we want to find an explanation that gives us sort of, for example, one feature or one rule that accounts for all of the cases we're trying to explain. And the problem is that the world doesn't always cooperate with our explanatory preferences, right? Sometimes the world is actually really complicated. Sometimes there are just arbitrary exceptions. And so what we found in sort of lab contexts where we can sort of control what the world is like, we give people some sort of learning task. They have to learn how to categorize two kinds of objects or do something else. And so we get to control in that case whether the world is well behaved and supports a simple and broad explanation or whether the world is less favorably disposed to human preferences and does not support a simple and broad explanation. And what we find is that when people are in that sort of sneaky world that doesn't have simple and broad patterns, the participants who are actively trying to look for explanations are slower to learn about the actual structure of that world than participants who are not looking for explanations.
Well, it also seems like this is the root of conspiracy thinking. You know, you have a few little things, you know about this, you know about that, then you're drawing all of these connections that may not be there.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think we still need more studies to really connect the dots between that idea and the phenomena that are well documented, but it seems very plausible to me. And you can think about conspiracy theories as sort of an error of over-explaining or overthinking something, right? A whole bunch of observations that are in fact unrelated, are in fact coincidental, get tied into a sort of elaborate narrative that goes back to one simple organization or intention or purpose. Yeah.
So you've been talking about how sort of the deeper roots of how we learn, how we think. And I'm wondering what the practical implications are for our schools, our educational system. I mean, are there things that we should be doing differently because of this kind of research that you've been doing?
I'll tell you two lessons that I think are particularly valuable. And they're ones that I do think a lot of teachers and educators recognize, but that we could be doing better. So one of them is that research that I've been involved in and many others as well has found that it's really valuable not just to be receiving explanations, but to be actually generating explanations. And for some of the same reasons that we've talked about already, there's a value to thought experiments, there's a value to doing a certain kind of cognitive work. So one striking example of this is that studies that have looked at the benefits of peer tutoring often find the student who is doing the tutoring benefits more than the student who is receiving the tutoring. And that's because the one who's doing the tutoring has to try to explain the material to somebody else. And guessing everyone who's listening has had the experience of sometimes trying to explain something to themselves or to somebody else, and in the course of doing so, either coming to understand it better, or sometimes realizing you don't understand it as well as you thought you did, which is also an important kind of learning. So that phenomenon, I think, is really powerful. It's referred to as the self-explanation effect. And I think we could be using that more.
So what would that mean practically? Like how would, I don't know, a teacher incorporate that in the classroom?
Yeah, so one of the ways this is often incorporated into curricula currently is often by having people do work in pairs or in teams, because those kinds of social interactions naturally create opportunities for one student to be explaining to another. So this is something that's already done in classrooms. I think it's the sort of learning that is a little less efficient in the short term, takes a little bit longer to make people actively engage in these processes to arrive at their own kind of deeper understanding. But when you can get it to work, it's much deeper, longer lasting learning. So I think that would be valuable. The other thing that I think research tells us about these processes of explaining to oneself is that you don't just learn the content of what you're trying to explain better. You also learn a certain kind of metacognitive skill. So metacognitive is a sort of jargony term that psychologists use to refer to our thinking and reasoning about thinking and reasoning itself. So if you are tracking what you do and don't know, you're engaged in a kind of metacognition. And one thing that explaining does that's extremely beneficial is it improves your metacognitive calibration. It improves your ability to keep track of what you do and don't know, what you are and aren't understanding, and so on. And when you're tracking that well, you're in a much better position to be an agent for your own learning, right? If you're trying to figure out how to study for a test, if you have a good sense of what you already understand and what you don't understand, you know how to spend your time efficiently and in a way that's going to actually be effective. If you don't have a sense of what you already know, you're going to be very inefficient as a learner, right? And so I think that scales up to all aspects of learning. So I think explaining is going to be beneficial because you learn the content you're explaining. It's also going to be beneficial because it's the exercise of this metacognitive skill that's going to allow people to be good learners.
So I know you are a parent yourself, and you've got 2 kids. Have you applied some of what you've learned about sort of the act of learning to your own parenting, or what you encourage your 2 children to do?
So I'm going to confess that one of my greatest disappointments is that having a PhD in psychology does not make me a better parent. I would have really loved to think that all those cognitive development courses I took and learned about translate into being a better parent. I think they, sadly, for the most part, have not, for reasons I'm happy to speculate about. But I do think that one of the things that this, the kind of work we've been talking about has encouraged me to do is to return questions back to my own kids. And I think a lot of parents do this sort of without necessarily knowing a lot of psychology about it, right? But if you're asked a question and you want your child to actually come to understand it, first instinct might be kind of go into lecture mode and just tell them the answer. But probably the better instinct, even though it's less efficient, is to actually start engage with them, right? Well, what do you think? Why do you think that? Do you think that's a good reason to think that? Are there other ways you can think of to think that? Right. And so I think engaging in those kinds of processes is useful for their learning, and is something that I try to do with varying degrees of success.
So I don't want to put you on the spot too much here, but a little bit. Why wouldn't you with a PhD in cognitive psychology? It seems like you've got all the tools there to really help your kids learn in the optimal way. But what do you think gets in the way?
Yeah, I guess I'll tell you the 2 first things that come to mind. So, you with all your knowledge of nutrition know exactly that you should eat the salad, not the chocolate cake, right? You have all of that knowledge. But it's one thing to have all of that knowledge, and it's another thing to actually reliably have your behavior reflect what you know and your best intentions and so on, right? So even if I know certain things, that doesn't mean that at the moment I'm going to remember them. I'm not going to be swayed by being frustrated, by being impatient, right? It doesn't. Knowing these things doesn't get rid of all of the normal emotions and experiences that get in the way of being the best humans that we ought to be. I think the other thing is that, actually very related to the value of explaining yourself rather than having somebody explain something to you, right? So one of my daughters is 14. She's starting to get to the point where some of her academic material requires studying. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I know something about good study strategies and what sorts of ways of trying to learn, vocabulary or math is going to be effective. I can tell her things, but getting that to actually translate to her own behavior is a whole nother step, right? I can also try to model these things for her as best I can, and to some extent I probably do that, but she doesn't see how I study, in my office at work. And so that's another case where knowing it is one thing, but actually successfully transmitting it to another person in a way that translates into their behavior is quite another. Right. And it turns out that teenagers don't always do what we ask them to, even when it's good advice.
So we've kind of been circling around this question of how we think, how we learn, and we're now in the age of artificial intelligence, and there are all these questions about, so does AI kind of do what we humans do cognitively? And there's even a more basic question, does AI actually think? Or does it do something sort of like thinking, but it really isn't thinking? Yeah,
so the first thing I want to say, because I feel like I see so many versions of this question, and I always want to qualify it, and now I have the opportunity. I feel like lately we've been talking about AI as if it's one monolithic category. But AI refers to lots of different things. If you actually look at our most contemporary, attempts to have something like artificial intelligence, there's lots of different kinds of systems with many different kinds of properties. I guess
to be more specific, I am talking about sort of the large language models, ChatGPT, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's often what people have in mind when they raise these questions, because they're so impressive in their capabilities and interactions with us. I think the short answer is yes, it does a kind of thinking, but it might be a somewhat alien kind of thinking, right? I'm also willing to say that chimpanzees think, and that, possibly caterpillars think. I'm not sure. I don't know that much about caterpillars, right? But I think I don't want to be sort of a human chauvinist about thinking, right? I think there's probably lots of forms of thinking. But what contemporary large language models are doing, I think, is fairly different from, the way human cognition works.
Can you explain that?
So one of the biggest differences that you see between, say, a child and a large language model is the nature of the training that's required to get them to the point where they can have a conversation with you. So in the case of a large language model, it'll have gone through this training procedure that involves, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words. Children do not have access to the entire internet and to the entire corpus of written English by age 5. They've been exposed to a lot of language, but not that much language. Nonetheless, they can have a really pretty reasonable conversation with you. And so the learning mechanisms involved in those two cases must be somehow importantly different in order for the child to use just the input the child gets and to be able to reach that point. In that sense, the child's input is much more impoverished than the large language model that gets basically the full written corpus of English. But in another sense, the child's environment has been so much richer than the large language models because the child has been embedded in a social context, has been embodied in a body that involves sensory capacities and so on. And so they have all of these other kinds of input that the large language model doesn't have at all. Those are really big differences that I think are going to make a difference to the nature of the representations and computations that are supporting the behavior that we see.
Well, and I mean, large language models are only operating with sort of things that are already out there in the world. I mean, sort of like this, aggregating massive amounts of data and information. And I mean, it's amazing what this can do, but it also seems limited in a way. I mean, it only can sort of work with kind of what would be predicted, I think, in terms of, collating all of that information.
I think that's right. And I think that example actually raises a point that is one of the reasons I think it's interesting to think about human intelligence in relation to AI. So when we see these systems perform something that seems very intelligent, often our first reaction is to think, well, is it really intelligent? Is it just parroting back what was in its training data? Do we think it's really reasoning? Is it just doing something that's much more sort of like basic, some sort of next word prediction that isn't really thinking? I want to re-ask all those questions for the human case, because I think in the human case, we might be a little bit too willing to assume that, I have the experience of thinking that all of my reasoning is perfectly creative and rational and so on. And so when I see other humans do similar things, I'm inclined to think that they are too, but maybe we're wrong about a lot of our own cases too, right? I think
so maybe we oversell our own abilities and we're actually kind of doing what AI already does. And I mean, just sort of recombining things that are already out there.
To some extent, right? I mean, I think we sometimes hold AI to a higher standard than we hold each other because we're already so willing to attribute certain kinds of capacities to humans. I don't want to say we're just doing what large language models are doing, but I do think a lot of what we do is just statistical pattern matching and generalizing for past patterns that we've observed. And in that sense, we're very much like large language models.
So we talked about curiosity before. Do you think curiosity is a word that can be applied to AI?
It already is being applied to AI, actually, into several learning algorithms in the context of AI. And one of the ways that it's being applied is in the sense of exploratory information search. So sometimes AI systems can learn better when they seek information just to kind of like map out their environment more. In that sense, I think, yes, they can be curious. But there's this other sense that humans, when we talk about being curious, I think part of what we're reporting is some sort of internal feeling of wanting to know. Right?
It's a drive. It's a motivation to learn about the world. And I guess the question is, does AI have that same drive?
Yeah. I mean, you can program in a tendency to seek information in particular ways. But in the human case, we often call curiosity an epistemic emotion. And that's because it's an emotion that's related to the acquisition of knowledge or learning. But the critical word there is epistemic emotion, right? And I mean, right now, I think I feel safe saying AI doesn't experience emotions. I think that could change, right? I think technology could change and that it could turn out that I was wrong. But my current bet is that AI does not feel emotions. And so if what we mean by curiosity is an epistemic emotion, then the answer is going to be no.
How would we know if AI has emotions?
That is a great question. I would want to think about how we make that inference for non-human animals, because we face a lot of the same challenges there.
So we kind of, I mean, I know that when I kind of know how my dog is feeling most
How?
of the time. Look at his face. I think he has an emotional response arranged very similar to humans in all kinds of ways, whether he's sort of upset or anxious or, moping. I can sort of guess that. I think, and I would bet I'm reasonably accurate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe two sources of information we use in a lot of those cases. So one is we observe something like input-output associations, right? So we observe that when he has I don't know your dog, when he has a ball, he's happy. When there's a squirrel, he's happy. When, doesn't have a ball, he's unhappy, and so on, right? So you observe all of these patterns of associations between things like features of the environment, your dog's emotional expressions, and so on, facial expressions, and so on. So that's one thing. We sort of observe these input-output associations. But the other thing is that we know something about the evolutionary history of dogs. We know something about the underlying mechanisms that might be generating those facial expressions.
Right, I mean, we know that they're kind of wired physiologically along similar lines as humans
That's
are.
right. That's right. And so I think in the case of AI, we're going to be faced with those same two sources of information. We're going to have to evaluate them, right? So it's much more straightforward to think about how to evaluate the input-output associations, right? Somebody has a humanoid robot. We can do all sorts of things to see how various features of its environment affect its emotional expressions, what it says, and so on, right? That part's straightforward. I think the really tricky part is, okay, well, what do we know about the mechanisms by which it works? And are they relevantly similar to cases like what we know about the mechanisms in your dog or the mechanisms in humans that lead us to think that in those cases there really is such a thing as emotional experience? And I don't know how we're going to do that.
I mean, really what we're asking is, will we know if an AI, let's say a robot, is depressed or happy or experiencing joy? Or, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
I think so. I mean, really this becomes a question of whether or not it's conscious, right? I think all of these emotional experiences are forms of conscious experience. And I don't have an answer to this. I'm not sure the field of experts does yet either. But I think what I would want to emphasize is that the question might not be as different as we think from the questions that we've been confronting even before AI. Questions like, I know that I have experience. I can feel my own experience. I can't feel your experience. So I'm just going to infer that you have experience that's similar to mine. And then you're doing something similar like that with your dog, perhaps informed with a little bit of evolutionary theory or some other things in the background there, right? But I think we're now confronting this harder problem because it's a more distant case from the case of our own personal experience. But I think it's the kind of question we've been confronting in lots of forms already prior to AI.
So we were speculating on whether curiosity is a feature of AI. What about creativity?
So if we go back to the formula that something creative has to be both novel and valuable or useful, then I think I see two places to challenge the creativity of contemporary LLMs, but at the same time, I don't think they're insurmountable problems that future AI can't address. So one is, are they really novel? Well, they're not novel if you think novelty requires doing more than something like producing the statistically most likely output based on your history of training, right? That's kind of what they're doing. That doesn't seem terribly novel. A lot of humans might be doing that a lot of the time too, right? But that doesn't seem terribly novel. Are they in a position to evaluate what's valuable or useful? That's really tricky because I think we are the people who determine what's valuable or useful, and these are tools that we've constructed. Those tools don't have a perspective from which to evaluate what's valuable or useful. So I think they can mimic human judgments to some extent, but they don't necessarily have their own evaluative perspective that's distinct from ours. But I think that's a feature of where we are right now. I don't want to say those are insurmountable problems.
Right. I mean, so right now, I think the assumption is, AI is doing what we've programmed it to do, but, it keeps getting more sophisticated. And I guess the question is, will there come a point where it's just doing something totally different that we didn't program, that it's gone off and, done its own thing and gone into entirely new realms that we could not have predicted? I don't know. I know this is a huge question, but what's your speculation there?
I certainly think that's possible, but there's maybe a few different forms of that question. So one would be just they're going to do things we might not have predicted in the same way that, a complex system might have behavior that we couldn't have predicted. And I think that's certainly possible. But I think part of your question, I think, is, will they ever be agents?
Yeah, right. Right. Autonomous agents, basically.
Yeah. I'm inclined to say there's not an in-principle obstacle to that occurring. I mean, I think part of what's interesting to think about is what conditions would be required for that to be the case. I think we aren't there yet, but I don't see a reason why, in principle, AI could not do that.
Does that scare you?
Sometimes. I mean, to be honest, these days, it's not what keeps me up at night. But I certainly think that there are risks there.
What would scare you? Like, what would be a scenario that you think, oh my God, what have we done?
I mean, I think so. I will tell. I think there's a lot of answers that you see in the kind of sci-fi apocalyptic scenarios, and I think those do concern me. But let me share something which I think maybe people have thought about less. One thing I worry about is how having alternative ways to do things that used to take human effort is going to change the nature of certain kinds of social relationships. So, for example, if somebody writes you a really heartfelt apology letter by hand, the fact that it was meticulously constructed and very compelling and written by hand gives you evidence about the effort they put into it. And so you have sort of an honest signal that they probably mean it because they took the time to do that. Okay, right now we already have the technology to, in a couple of minutes, produce a document that looks like it was handwritten and that seems like it was a very heartfelt apology, but really, the large language model did it. What's going to happen to our normal mechanisms for tracking people's reputation and effort and relationships and what we should believe about their communication in this world where we no longer have some of those honest signals about human communication? So that's something that worries me.
I mean, that's a really interesting response. So it's not what AI, that's not going to take over the world. Maybe it will, but that's...
Maybe it will, but I'm not the expert to answer.
But you're saying maybe it will change what it means to be human, essentially, or what we do as humans, and maybe sort of these kinds of subjective, personal, emotional experiences that we would consider central to being human. Maybe we'll just kind of outsource those.
That's right, and that worries me, although I also expect that we're going to evolve in the way that we accomplish some of these same things in new ways. And I don't yet know what that's going to look like. But we already see small versions of this, right? I do think, and I'll give you an example. I get a lot of email, as probably everybody listening does, and some of that email is people who are interested in working in my lab. And it used to be the case that if somebody who was an undergraduate somewhere had bothered to write 3 paragraphs about my papers, I would think, wow, this person's really interested in my lab because they took the time to read those papers and write this up. And now I don't know, right? So that's
what do you look for? Do you look for something quirky, maybe? I mean, are you looking for something sort of individualistic that is like that wouldn't have come out of just a chat GPT search?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a little bit of an arms race, right, where people are getting good. I mean, instructors face this who are teaching, right, and have to figure out if an essay they got might have been constructed by ChatGPT, right? So I think some of us who deal with this are becoming sensitive to sort of telltale markers that something might be a human versus not. But the technology is changing too, right? And so both of these things are changing at the same time, and we don't always have access to whether we get it right or not, right? So I might get in one of these emails and think to myself, this is definitely ChatGPT. I could be wrong, right? I never get independent evidence to tell me whether I'm getting it right or wrong. And so these sorts of things do worry me, and it's not yet clear to me how it is that basic aspects of our social interactions, our cooperation, our social relationships are going to change in response to this.
So I'm going to go to questions from our audience in just a minute, but I just want to follow up on that. I'm wondering if there's a silver lining here, that maybe because we're confronted with AI, and AI is becoming more and more able to do so much of what we can already do, especially kind of in the more computational end of things, maybe we'll become better humans because we kind of have to respond to AI. We have to kind of put our own stamp of individuality or, I don't know, human uniqueness or whatever it is. I don't know. Is that a scenario that could happen?
I love that scenario, so I hope so. I think independently of what the sort of endpoint is of AI, I mean, there probably isn't an endpoint, it'll keep moving, but I think it's already forcing us to ask really important questions about what makes us human, about what we're willing to outsource, about when we trust a computational system and when we don't. One place I think that we see that is in a domain like moral decision making. So I suspect all of us are perfectly happy to defer to our calculators on a complicated multiplication problem. But if I said, in the other room, I have this computer, and you ask it about any moral dilemma, and it tells you what you should do, I think a lot of you would feel a little uncomfortable about that. Like, well, does it really? And is it appropriate for me to just like outsource my moral thinking? I don't quite know what the right answer is there, but I think the fact that we're asking those questions is actually valuable and interesting and important, and is going to help us be clearer about what isn't, what do we mean by living a valuable human life? What are the kinds of decisions that we feel like we need to have some sense of authenticity or autonomy over? What are the ones that we can do in conjunction with these kinds of tools that we created in ways that we feel comfortable with?
Well, I can imagine that as we feed in more information to AI systems and, looking for what are essentially value judgments, that there might be more utilitarian decisions. So it's like, this is the thing you should do for the greatest good, but a lot of people might suffer in response, and yet the AI system might not really think, well, does it really matter? Just a few of those people will be hurt, but more people will benefit, and that, I think, cuts against the grain of how a lot of us actually feel about things.
Yeah, I mean, for a case like that, I think it just depends on how you set up the AI system.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
you could set up an AI system that responds to sort of Kantian rules of ethics, right, rather than utilitarianism. But I think you're right that the sort of thing that it seems to be better at than us is something like the very complicated cost-benefit analysis, and that certainly lends itself much more to the kind of utilitarian picture.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, I'm hoping that this conversation has opened up some interesting lines of inquiry from you, our audience, and we have a mic that is ready to roam here, and let's come to the front here.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. I do not have a simple answer because I'm still working through it. But I guess I'll tell you one thought is that I think in a lot of different domains, we sort of have rules for the conditions under which we consider something to be true. And one example of this is that when you go to the theater, you're sort of supposed to suspend disbelief, right? You sort of like know what the rules of theater are, so that if a character is on stage, you know that they're really on stage in the reality of that theater, but that if, they're close to the edge of the stage, that edge of the stage is not sort of like a real edge. You know the rules there. When you watch movies, often there's flashbacks. And you have to figure out for a given movie, what are the rules in this movie about the way that truth works? Is it the case that when there's a flashback, I'm seeing how reality really was? Or is it that I'm seeing it from this character's perspective and maybe it's not accurate? You sort of have to figure that out. And so I actually think that human psychology is pretty good at operating with these different sets of rules in different contexts for what we're going to be consider in that context to be true for some purpose. And part of what worries me a lot about contemporary political discourse is it seems like we've shifted what some of those rules are. What we get to assume in this context for our purpose of trying to come up with policy, for example, is going to be the shared truth.
Give me an example of what you mean by that.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is probably a kind of extreme example, but it's one that comes to mind. So, can a journalist just state what the size was at the inauguration for Obama versus Trump? I mean, yes, of course, it's an objective fact how many people were at the inauguration, and we have sort of like methods for evaluating how many people were there and so on. But this becomes contested. And is it okay now to treat that as something where, like, well, it depends on what you what you consider to be the right evidence, right? Is it about the actual things that counted how many people were there, or is it about who said what?
Can I just say, as a journalist, I think absolutely the journalist should say that. What is, what's the accurate number of people at the inauguration to take that? To me, that's without question, although obviously that becomes very political. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, it's the becoming political part that exactly I think I want to pick up on, right? So if humans are flexible about what the rules are in different contexts for what we accept as true, then it becomes very dangerous if, for example, we relax some of those journalistic norms and allow different sorts of claims. So
that's an example where there's evidence, there's a number that you can count. I think where it becomes murkier is if it's you can't, if it's subject to interpretation, how you evaluate what actually happened.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of how this might be influenced by AI, which was part of the question, I think what's concerning there is that AI gives us lots of tools to create things that look like good signals of truth but aren't. And so what I have in mind, for example, is if you create what looks like a photograph of an event and it's extremely compelling, it used to be the case that the only way you could have an image that was that compelling is that it was actually photographed, under those circumstances. Now we have alternative ways of creating that. And so I worry that some of our tools for sort of policing the boundaries of what we are allowed to say is true in certain contexts are going to be challenged by the fact that we now have these tools that obscure some of those signals.
Just to follow up on that, what do we do about that? I mean, that seems to be a real problem.
Yeah.
And
anyone knows, please let me know. I'm certainly thinking about that, but part of I'll tell you something that I've been thinking about, but I don't have evidence to suggest that this will work. I've been thinking a lot about these different sorts of like cultures or norms of belief and what we consider to be true in these different kinds of contexts. I think it's not as straightforward as saying that something is true or not. I think it is true of human discourse that we have these different sort of rules in different contexts for what we're allowed to say is true, right? So for example, I can probably tell you that my kids are the best kids in the world, and no one here is going to stand up and say, no, that's false, because you realize the sort of rules we're operating under. I'm telling you something about how great my kids are, right? I'm not telling you something about how many people were at the inauguration, where maybe somebody could stand up and say, no, that's false. So I think we're actually quite good as humans at having these different kinds of norms about what we accept as true or what we will or won't contest in different kinds of contexts. I think what we're much less good at is recognizing that we have that flexibility and being able to name it or identify it, right? So if we could come up with a good vocabulary for describing these different kinds of psychological modes we operate in, such that when I say to you, my kids are the best kids in the world, you can respond back and say, oh yeah, well I can see how you think that's true in way A, but it's not true in way B. We would be able to not mix those things up.
right, and actually have a reasonable conversation or maybe even argument about that.
Yeah, that's right. And so I've been thinking about the psychology of this really, right? What does the psychology look like? Can we come up with something like a taxonomy of these different ways of thinking about truth and belief? And then if we can identify that taxonomy, can that actually give people tools for navigating this more effectively? I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm trying.
Okay.
Yeah, I love the idea of something like imagination laundering, which is kind of like the picture I get from some of what you described, right? That I sort of think I'm creating something, but really it's kind of been laundered through these other kinds of mechanisms. I mean, one thing that I do worry about is the extent to which using some of the same tools that are based on what's most likely or most probable based on a large data set is going to push us all in the same direction, right? I mean, if you think about lots of human endeavors that involve imagination, like writing poetry, but also just coming up with like a creative new policy. All of these are cases where we actually want to have a lot of heterogeneity in the kinds of ideas that people bring to the table. We don't want everybody to be influenced by exactly the same sources in exactly the same ways, because we want to sort of explore the whole space of possibilities. And so I do worry about sort of a monoculture of ideas that could emerge if we are all being exposed to the same things in the same ways. That said, I think there's also ways to think about using AI and contemporary technology that could push against that, right? So right now, if you go use something like ChatGPT, you don't know what it was trained on. That's very opaque to us as a user. Anybody else using ChatGPT is pretty much using that same system, trained on the same things. But these technologies can be used in other ways, right? So you could imagine doing something where you curate your own system that you're going to interact with by giving it the exemplars that you think are the ones that embody your aesthetic values or your moral values and so on. And that gives you an opportunity to interact with an AI as a tool in a way that's different from somebody else who has their own curated version. So I don't see this as a fundamental obstacle to all technology, but it's something that definitely worries me for some of the developments that we see right now. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. It's a way that it might create inequality in some ways, despite the fact that people are interacting with the same systems. I find it useful to think, for many of the uses of large language models, to think about them as tools like other tools. You can use them well or you can use them poorly. There's some concerns that if everybody has access to the exact same tool, they're going to all be tempted to use it in the same way, and that's going to diminish innovation and creativity. But there's also the possibility that if everybody gets to fashion their own, right, and use it in their own way, it's what we're going to get, this sort of heterogeneity. So yeah, I think you're raising really important questions. I feel like I have a sense when I'm reading writing of any kind that maybe this was generated by a large language model versus not. I mean, I think you're right that grammatical errors can be one sign of that. If I had to try to articulate what I think I'm picking up on, it's something like how high frequency or fluent the text is. And the more high frequency and fluent it is, the more likely it is to have been a large language model. So a lot of the ways these work is they sort of generate the next word that's highest probability given the preceding sequences of words.
I mean, that's interesting what you're saying. It's sort of like the quote, better it's written, the more likely it's to be.
If by better you mean high frequency and fluent, right? Because
yeah, I mean, that's right.
Great writing, it's not
smoother,
gonna be
I guess.
Smoother, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to think of a good example. There's lots of cases in language where words tend to co-occur very frequently, right? So for example, maybe referring to a short stool is more common than saying tall stool, but it'd be kind of weird to say gigantic stool, right? Like that's just not something we say that frequently. And so I think a lot of what, insofar as I'm picking up on things, it's just these word co-occurrences. What seems like is the thing you would exactly expect to follow that. And if I get too many of those cases where it's exactly what I expect, that feels a little inhuman to me. But again, I want to qualify this by saying that I don't know when I'm right or wrong. Overwhelmingly, if I read something that's, for example, an email, I never get the ground truth for when those were versus were not done with the help of a large language model. And so that means that I'm very wary of my own ability to do this accurately. And I think most of us should be, because most of us are not in situations where we sort of ever get the ground truth for these kinds of cases. And these are systems that are constantly changing, right? And for the most part, they're changing in ways that make them more human-like, right? And so I think it's going to be a moving target, how it is that you do this.
Do you sometimes ask your students, did you use a large language model for this?
So far I have not, but it's partially because I have not taught large classes of the kind where this might arise since, this has really been a very recent phenomenon, right, where people are doing this. I taught a graduate seminar in the fall. I don't think any of the PhD students were using large language models. I could be wrong. I think one of the conversations that I have with people is to talk about why we have certain kinds of assignments and why they're not going to get the value of those assignments for themselves if they do use those kinds of tools for those assignments. This is not to say that there might not be other kinds of cases where those tools are appropriate, but if the skill you're trying to teach somebody is to, for example, be able to read a scientific article and extract the main ideas and summarize them, then of course they're not going to get the pedagogical value of that exercise if they use these tools.
Yeah.
I often think about this in terms of how we might think about how children develop a conscience, right? So I think most of us as parents or educators in that context don't think that the right strategy is to fill a child's head with all of the rules. We can't possibly spell out all of the rules for every single context they might encounter. Part of what we want to somehow give them is this ineffable judgment, which is what the conscience is, right? Which will allow them to take what they know and extend it to new situations. So my best guess for how we might end up with an AI that has a conscience is similar. I don't think it's going to be by trying to exhaustively enumerate all of the rules that govern how we make our judgments, or by trying to spell out every possible scenario and what would be right in those cases. I think it's going to be through some sort of a learning mechanism. Might be a learning mechanism that starts with certain kinds of sort of innate basis. That's probably partially true for the way that it works in the human case. But learning is going to be a huge part of that. And I do think that's what happens with kids, and I don't see any reason why, in principle, that couldn't also happen with AI.
Well, just to follow up on that, it seems like for certain cases where conscience would come to bear, it requires empathy. It requires a sense of someone else's suffering. And I guess those are questions of whether AI can develop those qualities.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two questions that are worth teasing apart. So one is, can you reliably make inferences about what somebody else's emotional experience might be in certain kinds of cases? And do you yourself as an agent have those emotional experiences? And it might be that those things can come apart, right? So I think that I don't know what it would be like for a bat to suddenly have its echolocation capabilities severed, right? I've never experienced echolocation. That's not a sensory capacity that I have. But I don't feel like that prevents me from being able to make the inference that it would be bad from the bat's perspective. Right, so that's a case where I don't have the first person experience that would go along with it, but I think I can make that inference. And I think that might be the sort of thing that AI would be capable of, even if AI does not itself have emotional experience. It's being able to use what it does know about the world in order to make inferences about what the consequences would be of particular actions for other people, including the emotional consequences for those people, even without experiencing those emotional consequences itself.
Okay. We could go on, but we have, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. So, and we've had a wonderful audience. Thank you very much for all of your engagement and your questions. And thank you, Tania.